Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to an edition of our podcast, Under the Macroscope. I'm joined today by Skybound Capital's Chief Investment Officer based in the Hong Kong office, Theodore Xu. And Theo, we have a very interesting macro topic today. It centers around a global shortage of semiconductors. Now, this has many ramifications. And before we get into what some of those are, perhaps you could position this podcast by just telling our listeners what is a semiconductor and why is this such an important topic?
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here again. I think if I directly throw at you all the acronyms, people will run away. So let me tell a story first. When I was a kid, the one property that I owned that was most precious was my computer, my PC. And I was the one who assembled that PC. I put together all the parts. And within all the parts, the most expensive piece was something called CPU. And that remains probably the most expensive piece in a computer today, in your laptop, or in whatever other mobile devices. Like in our cell phones that we use, there is also something like a CPU, a core chip. So that thing is the most common format of a chip or of a semiconductor product. Nowadays, semiconductors are no longer as precious as just a CPU in a computer. Semiconductor is actually all around us. It's a daily used item, and it is not just one item, it is actually multiple items in your day-to-day life. However, most people, if you're not working in the industry, you probably will never take notice of the chips or the semiconductors around you. So if I give you more examples, take this little mouse that I use, for example. There are roughly 10 to 20 chips in this little mouse. And you use it every now and then without noticing there are all these little chips in there.
So there are many uses in personal devices. That's what we're seeing here. So perhaps you could elaborate on why now there is a shortage. Obviously, there's been increased demand in personal computing devices, as you've mentioned, PCs, cell phones, etc., and various accessories. But there are other factors that are driving this shortage. Why?
Absolutely. So we have been seeing several trends within the industry. And the first one is really that over all these past decades, there has been a huge consolidation of players in semiconductor, and particularly in one step of semiconductor manufacturing. Those players are called foundries. And in layman's terms, they are basically the producer of the end chip. And the consolidation that I was referring to is a result of fierce competition year over year. But 20 years ago, we had roughly 20 major players as foundries. And today, we probably only have the top two or top three. So there has been a huge consolidation, which doesn't necessarily result in an expansion of capacity. So yes, people compete with each other and they are aiming for higher technology. In the semiconductor industry, they call it nodes, so higher nodes or advanced nodes. So that is their top priority, but their supply hasn't really expanded as much or as quickly as the consumption increase that we have talked about. What adds to the problem was COVID. So last year, when COVID was spreading around the world, many of these manufacturers decided that they want to contain their usage or contain their production capacity. They don't want to be producing too much without people needing them. However, as we have already seen now, that economy is picking up rapidly. People are increasing consumption and demand for everything. And I literally mean everything, not just semiconductors. All of a sudden, the constrained supply is far from meeting the demand. It's lagging too much behind. Well, as to the complexity is some of the end user, for example, we talked about cell phones. Some of the cell phone maker decided to hoard inventory in fear of future scarcity. So all these different factors combined lead to this shortage that we are seeing today. But you are absolutely right. The demand itself is important. It is driving all these. I mentioned cell phone. 10 years ago, we also had cell phones, Nokia phones. In a Nokia phone, you had less than 10 chips. And nowadays, in any average phone, you have more than 100 chips. Similarly, in an automobile, the car you drove 10 years ago had less than 10 chips. And now, on average, they have more than 100.
And also, we've seen the emergence of cryptocurrency. Is that a factor?
That is a factor, but that is not a material factor. I think what we are alluding to here is, in addition to the increased demand from some existing products that we are familiar with, there are some new usage of chips. And one of the key usage that we can think of is artificial intelligence. Globally, we are seeing more and more services, products that are trying to incorporate artificial intelligence. But behind that, you need computing power. And to power that computing power, you need chips. So ultimately, the gradual growth of artificial intelligence, how they are interacting with our daily lives, are increasing the demand for chips. And out of all these artificial intelligence usage, cryptocurrency is making up a small piece, but we have seen shortage in certain particular aspects of semiconductors that were more driven by cryptocurrency. For example, starting from roughly 7-8 years ago, and more mining companies in cryptocurrencies try to use graphic cards. That directly led to a big shortage of graphic cards globally, and game players were hungry for graphic cards too. So there was a big competition in between the two. And starting from early this year, we have seen some of the other cryptocurrencies that are consuming a lot of storage capacity, which leads to a shortage of your hard disk, basically. Now, overall, cryptocurrency has led to shortage in certain silos of the semiconductor industries.
So the key question is matching this demand. How do we ramp up supply?
Sure. Unfortunately, the answer is we will not be able to ramp up supply in the very near term. This directly circles back to my point on the consolidation within the industry led to us to today's situation. And when speaking of semiconductors, this is a cyclical industry. It takes a long time to build up capacity, and also it takes a long time to plan, simply. Once you're done with your planning, then it's all about money. You need to have the money to start working on this. And unfortunately, semiconductor is a high capex industry, which means investing into semiconductors require significant investment in capital. I talked about foundries. To give you a rough idea, if some company is trying to set up a new foundry, let's say in China today, the estimated initial investment will be in billions of dollars. And that's just to get the groundwork. And that doesn't even include buying some of the key machineries, etc. And speaking of machinery, there is a company globally which is a monopoly in supplying the most important machine in semiconductor producing. And those machines can easily cost you $500 million per piece. And that's the amount of capital that is required in semiconductor industry. However, back to your question, I think the shortage today obviously has already been a awakening call to many people. And plus, we have been seeing a deglobalization trend where a lot of countries are trying to insource instead of outsourcing. Therefore, the global trend we are seeing now is the major economic powers are all trying to ramp up their in-house semiconductor capability. For example, in US, it is planning a $200 billion plus fund that will go on investing into the value chain. So from the manufacturer of supplies or parts to the foundries and to the users of these semiconductor chips. Similarly, we are seeing similar initiatives in Japan, in EU. EU is planning currently a 100 billion euro plus fund for the European Union only. And in China, we have been seeing several of these national funds being set up over the past decade. So the government just put money together and invest like a private equity investor into their semiconductor industry. So we are seeing all these global initiatives, and I'm quite certain that in 5-10 years' time, we will go into the other phase of this cyclical industry where you see a lot of oversupply.
So savvy investors, just finally, always love an industry that's perhaps undersupplied. And you mentioned the value chain, Theo, in the creation of these semiconductors. I mean, what sectors would you be looking at then to take advantage of that value chain?
Sure. There are several key phases in semiconductor production. For example, you need a machinery, as I mentioned, and at the end, you need to test the end products. So there are these different phases. And in each of these phases, you have major players, global players. I would say we have done extensive analysis along the value chain. And so far, we are relatively more optimistic on suppliers of semiconductor machinery, and particularly in some of the more monopoly subsectors where you only find one or two suppliers. Competition in the foundry, meaning the production of end product, has been very fierce, despite the fact that there are only a handful of major manufacturers today, and they are spending too much on seeking more advanced technology, which actually compresses their margin because it lowers your capacity, and it also leads to more faulted products, etc. So we are neutral on the foundry. And in terms of the testing that I mentioned, historically, this has been a very boring subsector of semiconductor. Boring in the sense that it doesn't require rocket science technology, and it's widely spread around the world. You can have testing suppliers here and there. But at the moment, we are actually seeing some shortage there too. For example, Malaysia has always been a key home to many testing facilities. But given the recent spikes in COVID cases and some of the other geographical related issues, we are seeing a big suspension in Malaysia, which leads to such shortage. So similar to the foundry and the other phases of the supply chain, we believe even in the testing phase, we are seeing some investment opportunity for new facilities, etc.
Fascinating. It's really an interesting sector, and one which I guess we don't realize how much affects our daily lives without even knowing it. So some fascinating insights there. Certainly an industry and a sector to keep a close eye on. As always, Theo, wonderful to get your views on Under the Macroscope. Don't forget you can access the Under the Macroscope podcast on Apple, Spotify, and on the Google podcast platform for Android. And all the past podcasts are available at Skybound Capital's website, www.skyboundcapital.com. Until next time on Under the Macroscope, have a great week.